So if you haven't seen my last video, my most recent challenge was to create a full Roblox game in 1 hour or less. Now this challenge did end up going pretty well, but I definitely didn't create a full Roblox game by the end of it. I ended up taking the liberty of finishing the game after the video into something kind of playable, since I did really like the idea of the game. And after that playable version, I got a ton of positive feedback and constructive criticism on the game, and even some rather questionable speedrunning strategies, which I actually thought were pretty cool. So to hone in on the idea of speedrunning, I'm going to be adding a ton of new features and worlds to Blocky Roll to make it one of the top speedrunning games on Roblox. I'm going to be advertising this game heavily and making sure the word gets out there, so if you do want to see that happen, make sure you like and subscribe and leave a comment letting me know what you think of the game. But without further ado, let's start making some new features in Blocky Roll. Alright, so we are in studio, and I will admit Blocky Roll is a pretty bare bones game right now. Everything is just a little, flat, and nothing really looks alive. So I am going to be looking for a map builder to actually spice up the game in the future. But for now, we're going to have to kind of deal with this map style. What I really do want to focus on is adding some new features that will allow more speedrunning strategies to be made, and I think I'm going to be adding those in the new world. So far we have 3 worlds if we're counting the tutorial, and pretty much World 2 innovated a lot more than World 1, and I do want to make World 1 at least a little easier because it is a huge step up from the tutorial, so we're going to be working on that for a bit. While I work on fixing up World 1, I do want to talk about what I plan on adding to the new world. So World 2 didn't really add much to Blocky Roll. It had a newer format that worked well with the game, but it didn't change much. With this new world, I plan to add a lot more. First off, I want to innovate on the boost pad. Right now, the boost pad only really has one use, and it's to boost the player upwards. But it definitely is possible to rotate the boost pad to boost the player in other directions, right? Now, usually to get the most out of the boost pad, a player has to roll onto it so they can become susceptible to physics. Then they can get boosted much farther into the air, where they can then recover and gain even more height. Now, since this is the only way to get the most out of the boost pad though, using it at different angles can get tricky. Now, I do think that this could be a really nice feature to implement into the new world, since it makes using the boost pad just a bit more difficult, making the player focus on the timing of it just a bit more. Alright, so World 1 got a few significant changes. I made this little jump over here, just one jump instead of 2 little cubes, and now the player can just jump once and then slide down. There's no more gap between the slide. Here, there's still a gap between the slide, but the slide is actually a little more down, and they just slide up here. This platform's a little bigger and also inclined to match the shape of these, and all of these are the exact same size now for some consistency. And over here, now we have a little pathway so that if a player doesn't get a good launch, they could still run up if they're not very, heavy on the speedrunning side of the game and they kind of just want to complete the level. They can just run up here, and if you get a good launch, you could end up here, so you could have a good time. And pretty much the rest of it is unchanged. I thought all of this was pretty much fine. I might go ahead and change it in the future because these b-hops here are a little tough. But we're going to focus on creating a new world now. This world was really nicely made. I like how this one came out overall. It has a nice theme to it. The format is a little different than the others. It's a little more unique, and it just feels a lot nicer. So the next world, I wanted it to have more of a greenery vibe to it. And I'm also going to be introducing a new feature, which are jump pads. Now, jump pads are pretty much just going to be these pads that are going to be placed throughout the map. And while you're in a rolling state, if you land on one, it'll bounce you up. Now, I guess they should be called bounce pads instead of jump pads, but we'll see. I'll figure that out later. But before that, I actually wanted to go ahead and fix some issues with the Launchpad. Right now, in its current state, the Launchpad was only able to launch you in one direction. If you never noticed, the Launchpad on both World 1 and World 2 were facing the exact same way, and this was intentional. The Launchpad currently didn't have the proper code to actually launch you in the correct direction, so I had to go in and make a few adjustments to the code to actually make sure that the Launchpad could launch you in any direction it was facing. I decided to go with the 4 main points that the Launchpad would be facing, so they're all 90-degree angles, and now the Launchpad could launch you any way it's facing. After that, I went ahead and started working on the new world. Now for this world, as I mentioned, I wanted it to have sort of a grassy green vibe, but I also wanted it to be a little different from the other worlds. So I decided that this world would take place at night. It'd be a nighttime map, and I thought it'd be a really nice way to experiment with the lighting in the game and just make the world overall look really nice. So I went through a lot of changes with this world, and I made sure that it looked perfect before I actually started building the rest of it. So I went ahead and made some lights, I made some more features, and I overall just made sure it looked as best as it could before I started implementing things like slopes and bounce pads and all that. Once that was set, I went ahead and implemented the starting gate. Now the starting gate, if you don't know, it's pretty much the gate that is at the beginning of every map, and when you pass this gate, it'll start your timer so that you aren't wasting time in spawn. And it also allows you to have some breathing room whenever you respawn so that the timer just doesn't instantly start. I then went ahead and started adding some slanted jumps, which I thought were just going to be a nice feature to have, and they did end up looking really nice, and I added some lights to them as well to make sure that the world was properly lit. I didn't want this world to be too dark, but I do think I'll have a world like that in the future, which will just make things a little more tricky. The jumps ended up working pretty fine. They weren't anything special, but I did want to just make some nice slanted jumps. I then went ahead and added the feature I was talking about earlier, which was a rotated boost pad. Now this boost pad, I wanted it to have no floor under it to catch you because that makes it a lot trickier, and you do have to make sure the timing is right. And that's exactly why I put it near the spawn, so that speedrunners can make sure they're timing their respawns right and making sure that they actually have enough time and room to make sure that they're making that jump on time. I then went ahead and did a bit of debugging, making sure that World 3 would actually work on the world menu. The world menu could be a little finicky at times, and I do have to go back and eventually make it look nicer and fix it, but right now it's pretty much fine. I just had to make sure that it could be selected through the world menu. I then went ahead and enabled one of the dev-only features in Blocky Roll, which is the path debug feature. Now the path debug essentially just helps me figure out what angle a player is traveling at whenever they use a boost pad or a launch pad, and it just helps me figure out where I should put the next jump. Now this is a very useful feature that I use a lot, and it didn't really take a long time to code, so I'm actually pretty happy with that, but I am going to change this feature a little later to make sure that it's not lagging out my game just by placing a bunch of random parts. I also went ahead and added a bit of exclusive lighting for this world onto the boost pad because I thought it just looked really cool and I wanted some neon lights on the boost pad, and it actually ended up looking really nice in the end. It gave this little lighting effect whenever it came back down, and it was just really nice to look at. I actually then went ahead and hopped into Blender and actually started modeling a custom slope model. So until now, I've been using some free models to actually get the slope working, just because I was on a time constraint originally and I used some very sloppy slope models, which is why sometimes you can bounce off of the slopes when you're sliding on them. And I needed to make sure that the slope models weren't like this. I needed to make sure that they were as smooth as possible, so I went ahead and modeled my own 45-degree slope just to make sure that the game was as accurate as possible and there weren't any problems. After importing the new slope model, I went ahead and started making a slide in game, making sure that it was at the right 45-degree angle, and I also added some lighting to it just to make sure that it was properly lit up. And this slope was actually going to lead into something that I've been thinking about doing for a while, which is the player sliding into a bounce. Now this is a pretty tricky mechanic to handle, and I thought it'd be the best way to actually say, hey, this is World 3, it's gonna start getting hard here. And after a few more hours of world building, this is what World 3 was looking like. And so that's pretty much it for this devlog. I really enjoyed making World 3 and I thought it was just something amazing that I actually managed to pull off. I really like how the bounce pad came out, and I actually did make a few more adjustments to it. And the final update isn't only going to have World 3, but it will have a lot more features too, so make sure you guys stick around for that. But without further ado, I'm usually Reggie, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.